Sounds good. There we go.
Okay, I can see folks are starting to join. We can give it another couple more minutes, and we can start. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and begin now. I can see folks are starting to join the session, and as we're kind of getting through the first couple slides, I'm sure more folks will join here accordingly. So thank you all, everyone, for joining this fourth quarter 2021 education session for the City of Bel Air Environmental Sustainability Board Learning Academy. Today we're going to talk about the energy transition in Texas and beyond. And I will be the moderator, Rajiv Pandya. I'm with the ESB. I'm the chair of the ESB. And our presenter tonight is going to be Dr. Daniel Cohan of Rice University. So, okay, we can go to the next slide. So a little bit about the ESB and the Learning Academy. So ESB stands for Environmental Sustainability Board. And basically our function is to make advisory recommendations to the City of Bel Air City Council in the initiation, prioritization, and development of public education programs, policy, and actions relating to environmental sustainability. We have 7 Bel Air residents are appointed to the ESB by City Council, and we serve a 2-year term with a maximum of 3 consecutive terms. And here's a list of the members of the ESB currently, and I am the chair of it right now. And going into 2022, we will probably have some changes here, specifically with Brian Witt, who is now going to be moving to City Council. He was a member of the ESB here for the last few years. And basically, we're going to organize these ESB Learning Academy sessions every quarter on various topics. So this year, this would be our 4th one. And we've done one on recycling. We did one on composting. We did one on solar energy earlier in the year in the first quarter. And then this time we're focusing on the energy transition. So anyway, so that's the ESB Learning Academy. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the speaker, Dr. Daniel Cohan. So Dan is an associate professor of civil and environmental engineering at Rice University. He's been at Rice since 2006. He has published 50 peer-reviewed publications, and he's a member of he was a recipient of the National Science Foundation Career Award. He's also a member of the NASA Air Quality Applied Sciences team. And here's a link to his website. And he also has a book coming out here in fairly soon. Here it's going to be published, called Confronting Climate Gridlock. And that's going to be a book that Dan's going to be, he's been working on for quite some time now, published, and it's going to be published in March of 2022. Also not mentioned here is Dan also received a BA in Applied Mathematics from Harvard University and has a PhD in Atmospheric Chemistry from Georgia Tech. So with that, Dan, Dr. Cohan, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Rajiv. Great to be here. Great to hear the interest from Bel Air. I'm a Houstonian, but live just a couple miles away, and really appreciate the work that Rajiv and others have done mentoring the energy and environment class that I teach. So a lot of students at Rice have benefited from that. We talked about a topic, and I think it might have been energy transition in Texas and globally. And I mean, could teach many hours, if not weeks or months on that topic. And so I tried to narrow it down to two aspects. One is the Texas situation of the Texas electricity. And then I think we'll take a pause for questions on that. And then I'll move to the energy transition in the United States, specifically focusing, like my book did, on the transition of what's needed to address climate change.
And hey, Dan, if I can interrupt you.
Mm-hmm.
Just wanted to mention to the audience, the audience will be muted during this presentation, but we will be collecting all of the questions in the Q&A little chat box there. So go ahead and put your questions in there, and we're going to definitely have time at the end for some Q&A, and even in between for your questions as Dr. Cohan is going through the presentation. So I just wanted to make sure and mention that. So thank you.
Right. Thanks, Rajiv. And yeah, questions on Texas, we'll have a break in the middle to go through those, and then the national ones after that. So talking about Texas, and I mean, there's so much to energy, but I think since February, the freeze that left more people in the dark, more blackouts, more deaths than any other blackout event in the United States, obviously what's on our mind is a key aspect of the Texas energy transition is Texas electricity. And Texas is unique. Many people didn't know this until February. I think most of us know this now, that we operate our grid. This ERCOT grid is an island, that everything else in the western part of the US, the seam that you see, everything to the west, actually extending on down to Baja California, extending up into Western Canada, this is all interconnected Western interconnect. And yeah, California manages part of its grid and other things manage parts of their grid, but there are at least wires connecting all this. All the Eastern United States extending up into Eastern Canada is connected as an Eastern interconnect. And we're here with this island that only has a couple of slender, barely any connection to the rest. The other thing that you'll see is what this map shows is this shows yellow everywhere that gets really good sunshine, blue everywhere that gets really good wind. And you see Texas is uniquely blessed of having both. They put in green where it's really strong winds and really strong sun. So a lot of strengths to our position here, but a lot of vulnerabilities, because what happens in Texas stays in Texas. We need to get a balance because we can't import and export from our state. And so with that, we have this diversified portfolio shown here, is that natural gas is by far the leading source of our electricity for now at 45%. Wind just a couple of years ago surpassed coal and now surpasses it by a big margin. We have 2 nuclear plants, and then this other that includes a couple of very small hydro dams. Solar barely makes its way into other, but solar is growing incredibly fast. Texas is adding more solar, faster than any state ever has in US history. And so with all this, everything is bigger in Texas. We lead the nation in emissions of everything, emissions of CO2, emissions of sulfur dioxide, emissions of nitrogen oxides. All that is the highest in Texas because we burn more coal than any other state. Not on a percentage basis, 18% isn't anything extraordinary, but you add it up and it's more coal burned in Texas than anywhere else. More natural gas is burned in Texas than anywhere else. We had worse blackouts than have been experienced anywhere in US history. The blackouts we had in February, if you add up how many homes times how many hours were out, it was about 50 times the amount of outages is what California experienced during its wildfire crisis. And some good things. We lead the nation in how much wind power we generate. Again, not percentage, Iowa leads that, but just the most kilowatt hours of wind. And we have the fastest growing solar. So California leads us in overall solar, but we're growing faster than anyone else. So what the emissions do, this is a study that my graduate student, Brian Strassert, wrote his master's thesis about, working with undergraduate student Su-Chen Te. We had this paper that we published and we went through this list of coal power plants. And the ones that I've blacked out are ones that have actually been retired since we did this study, because there's been this big move away from coal that was losing money. And it was not just losing money, but we found it was deadly. So this last column showed, by our estimates, when we ran our air quality models and our health effects models, how many people were actually dying from the pollution caused by these plants each year. And we found that some plants cleaned up their pollution pretty well. They had state-of-the-art scrubbers, state-of-the-art nitrogen oxide controls. They contributed to a few deaths worth of air pollution a year. But we had some that don't even have scrubbers that have been required at every new power plant for 40 years now, but they've been grandfathered in and allowed. Texas allows more plants to operate with scrubbers than any other state. And so we found, for example, Plant Parish in Fort Bend County is by far the deadliest remaining power plant in the state. So with this sort of problem, and we did modeling and we showed that the plumes from an individual plant can carry across the state, can actually contribute to haze in Class 1 areas. Those are scenic areas in neighboring states, sometimes to Big Bend, but the way the winds blow, often they contribute to the Wichita Mountains or Caney Creek haze that's impairing the visibility there. And that study got the attention of Eric Lipton at the New York Times, who sort of replotted our modeling in this New York Times feature that came out a few years ago. So we have this backdrop that even before there were any blackouts, our power system wasn't serving us that well. It was causing hundreds of deaths. It was causing more climate warming pollutants than any other state, more haze causing pollutants than any other state. And then February hit and we realized we have a whole different problem on our hands. It's not just that our electricity is too dirty, it's that we didn't have enough electricity when we needed it the most. And so what this shows, these dotted lines, this carries from February 7th into, of course, we sometimes know this is the Valentine's Day freeze on through later in the week, is that these blue dots show what we think how much power people would have demanded. And usually how much they demand and how much is generated is in a pretty close balance with each other. Or sometimes there's surplus when it's plenty windy and we have more power than we need. But for the most part, they line up. And then we have this is the catastrophe. This is the time when we think demand would have been as high as these blue dots, but the grid was only able to supply what's shown in the gold. And so this gap means about 1/3 less than what people demanded was what the grid was able to supply. The green shows that we weren't able to move in very much power from other states because we don't have connections. So we couldn't do any imports. The green shows imports and exports. We couldn't do that. So supply fell 40% short. And why did that happen? And by falling short, blacking out so many people, there were nearly 200 deaths attributed to it. Some people look at the number of deaths that happened and think there were actually more excess deaths than the 200. Most of those from hypothermia and some of them from carbon monoxide poisonings. My wife is a emergency room doctor who was treating more cases of carbon monoxide poisoning than she had seen in her entire career combined. This is someone who worked a few years in sub-Saharan Africa and had never seen conditions as bad as they were right here in Houston. So why did we fall short? Why couldn't supply keep up with these light blue dots. Why couldn't it keep up with demand? Well, every component of the grid failed us. Coal, the thermal, reliable source that's supposed to, even though it's got such deadly air pollution, at least it's there when we need us, firm and operational source. Well, 40% of it failed during the storm. Wind turbines froze. So wind turbines can be designed with de-icing. Wind turbines operate on Antarctica, wind turbines operate in Denmark and Canada, many colder places, but we didn't bother to put in de-icing equipment. So a number of wind turbines froze when the fog and mist froze onto the blades. One of the two nuclear plants went down, or I should say one of the 4 units. One of the 2 units at the South Texas plant failed, and 40% of the gas capacity was down. And it was a mix of the equipment failed, so the power plants failed, but then of the power plants that were still operating, some of them couldn't get enough gas. So the rough estimate is that about 2/3 of the natural gas failures were because the plants themselves froze, and 1/3 was because the natural gas supply system failed. And so the plants that remained didn't have enough gas to burn. But it's hard to do that. It's kind of like if all we did was winterize our cars and we don't have gasoline stations winterized, then no matter how well we winterize our cars, if we don't have gasoline, we're not going to be able to drive. Or if we have winterized all the gasoline stations, not our cars. So kind of like that, we need gas supply and power plants to both winterize, and both sides of that equation failed in this storm. So that's what let us down, but there could be more sources coming on. Oh, sorry, accidentally skipped ahead. Okay, this makes more sense. So causes of the blackout. ERCOT went back and looked at the causes, and this is very similar to what has been found by University of Texas, by FERC, and by NERC, is when they look at the situation in these days, the 15th and 16th, where we had the worst blackouts, they find that there was this one nuclear plant was down, was one unit was this dark green. The coal that failed us was we lost 40% of our coal supply. That's the gray that failed. And the overwhelming, about 2/3 of all the shortfall came because of natural gas that failed. And then the wind turbines freezing and malfunctioning was this amount here. And then there was some snow and ice on some solar panels. That's that sliver of yellow that failed us there. So it overwhelmingly gas, but every component underperformed. So moving forward, we're going to have a very different grid. This shows the growth in wind. This starts at 2000. It took until the year 2002 to get our first gigawatt of wind. By 2012, so 10 years time, we went up by a factor of 10 to 10 gigawatts. Go forward another 9 years to today, to 2021, and we have hit 34 gigawatts, far and away more than any other state has. And it's expected to grow a little bit from here, expected to grow to about 40 in the coming couple of years. We had almost no batteries. We just hit our first single gigawatt worth of battery storage this year. It's expected to quadruple next year. And I don't believe that it's suddenly going to stop growing in 2023. It's just batteries can be built pretty quickly. And so we just don't know the projects that might come online in 2023. So note that it's explosive growth, factor of 4 in a year, factor of 5 that we grew this year, but it's still small. We can't back up 34 gigawatts of wind turbines with 4 gigawatts of batteries, most of which are batteries that would only last for an hour or two if you discharged them completely. And then you can see the unbelievable growth that we've had in solar is it took until 2017 for Texas to get its first gigawatt of solar on the grid. So 15 years after wind got to 1 gigawatt, solar finally did. But then just 4 years later, this year, we've already hit 10 gigawatts. The fastest that we added this past year is the most solar that any state has added in US history in a single year. And we're expected to triple that by 2023. So unbelievable change where solar is going to be on par with as much as we have wind pretty soon, whereas it used to be we were a wind and no solar state. So where are the new ones going? Well, we did a study that waiting final approval from the journal with undergraduate student in my group, Ricky Morse, together with Joanna Sucerowicz, who wrote a related paper a couple of years ago. And we looked, where are they being proposed? And so with wind, I think a lot of people realize that West Texas and the Panhandle are strong, so we have a lot of proposals. Maybe not as many of you were aware that there are a lot of wind farms being proposed down in South Texas because the sea breezes kick in on summer afternoons. So even though on average, it isn't as windy down here as it is in Central and West Texas, if it can be windy on summer afternoons when our air conditioners need it most, this is really valuable power generated here. Solar, it is sunniest in the western parts of the state. So you see a lot of solar farms being proposed out here. It isn't as sunny here, but this is close to Houston, close to Bel Air. And so a lot of solar farms are deciding, hey, we might not get as much sunshine, but if we don't have to travel across as many transmission lines that are clogged, that can be a good place for us to locate. So in our study, we tried to understand why are they being cited in these ways. And what we found is that with solar, solar does what you expect it to. Solar sun shines in the day, not at night. The bottom line shows July. So you see that it has more output in July than it does in January. In January, there's more of a difference to be in dry West Texas. In the summer, they're all pretty similar. But wind shows these complicated patterns. And a nice thing about wind is that in the wintertime, wind blows strongest at night and then slows down during the day. So it's almost an inverse pattern of solar. So if you can imagine adding these wind pictures of what the wind output goes from midnight to noon back into the evening and add that up to the solar, they balance each other. So it's windy at night, then the winds slow down while the sun is rising, then the sun sets and the winds pick back up. So it doesn't work every single day, but on average, and the vast majority of the days, they work in complementary ways. In the summertime, it's a more complicated situation where West Texas has the strongest winds at night when we need to cover that when the sun's not shining. But South Texas, those coastal wind farms have this really ideal feature that just as the sun is setting at 6, 7, 8 p.m., when we're on this big down ramp from solar, those South Texas and coastal wind farms can perform really well. And if you blend these together, you can satisfy the vast majority of the source. So in this paper, we looked at a case where we said, could we get rid of coal? Because our previous papers have shown that coal is deadly, that coal is causing haze. The coal is actually more expensive to use than wind or solar are. So could we replace it? So we wiped out the white boxes. The white boxes show how much of our power at each given hour of the day came from coal before, and could we wipe it out and could we replace it with these things down here? Could we replace it with new solar in this orange? And could we replace it with new wind in this light blue? And we found that we would switch from the red curve to the black curve. We would end up with surpluses part of the day, and we would end up with a gap at night, but a gap at night when demand isn't at its highest. So this is actually a very manageable gap, and we would have surpluses at these 3, 4, 5 p.m. types of hours. That's so far the easiest time or the hardest times for the grid to meet. So what we found is we could optimize, and we don't even need to build all of these. We found that we would only need to build about a third of these projects in order to almost completely replace all of the coal that we're getting on the grid today. So an encouraging result. What would be a challenge though is we would need to site those in places far away from our cities and where our power plants are today. And so we would need more transmission going to West Texas. Texas led the nation in building out the CREZ, the Competitive Renewable Energy Zone lines to West Texas. If you build it, they will come. They built these lines to target these zones. And sure enough, of course, Texas has more wind farms than any other state. That was this burst of investment in transmission. What this is showing is how much did Texas spend on transmission compared to every other region in the country. So for that 2013, we spent a lot once to get those built, but then we were able to lower our investments, and it's allowed that explosive growth in wind and solar to West Texas. And so what that's done is back before we built those lines, the state had to curtail a lot of its wind. So this blue shows how much was it wasting. How often did ERCOT have to go tell a wind farm, hey, nice that you're generating wind, but we have too much power right now because it's windy and we can't move that power from West Texas to our cities. So this blue shows that 17% of all wind power back in 2010 or so had to be curtailed, had to be shut off. We couldn't get that power to market. It was just going to waste out in West Texas. Then we built those lines. And even though wind power grew, the brown shows what percent of wind is of our overall power, grew from it had just been 7% of the supply up to being 23% of the supply. We curtail less of it. We dropped for a while, right after we built the lines, we dropped to curtailing just 1%. Now that we've stopped building new lines and wind keeps growing, we're creeping back up. So now we're back up to wasting about 5% of our wind power because we need to be building a new set of transmission expansion to address this. So that takes us to the midpoint of Texas. So Rajiv, let us know what questions there are, or encourage people to do the chat feature or however it is that they're
posting. So at this point, folks, we don't have any questions in the Q&A. So I just want to remind folks that any questions that you have, please put them in there, and then we'll kind of collect them as we go along, and at the end, and we'll answer them. But at the moment, right now, I don't see any in the Q&A box. So yeah, so you can keep going there.
Okay, sure. Yeah. All right. And yeah, if you do think of questions that I can get back to at the end, happy to do that. But we'll be shifting gears to a different topic now. So moving from Texas to the national situation, and really the situation that in my book I framed this as the what the U.S. would need to do to decarbonize its economy, but it really applies to any developed country trying to clean up its economy. And move to cleaner energy and move to reduce emissions, is that clean energy is the main thing we need to do if we want to address climate change. Is that the vast majority, 90% or so of all emissions come from our burning of fossil fuels, and to a lesser extent biofuels. And so if we want to address climate change, the overwhelming thing we have to do is we need to build a new economy based on clean energy. And what I argue in the book, and what many other scholars have argued, is that there are really three pillars on which that's built. Is that we need more energy efficiency, we need clean electricity, and we need to use that clean electricity wherever we can by switching fuels away from solid and liquid and gas fuels to run things on electricity, what's sometimes called electrification, or switch to other clean fuels for things that can't be electrified. So like, we're not going to electrify intercontinental planes, so we need other fuels to switch to for those. And then two things that I'm not going to talk about tonight is that there are other greenhouse gases that are important, like methane, like nitrous oxide, like halocarbons. Happy to talk offline about those, but just to have a manageable scope, I talk about those in the book, but not here. And then carbon sinks. I'm not going to talk about tonight, happy to talk about in Q&A, is how do we pull CO2 out of the atmosphere is going to be important as well. But I'm going to focus on this main central set of three pillars. The reason why we need to act on this is because the world is warming very quickly. If we go back and we set a baseline of what the temperatures were in the second half of the 1800s, and we set that as our 0 point, that's about as close as we can get to what things were pre-industrial, because that's when we started having enough thermometers globally that we can look at the temperature record. Is that from that time up to the present day, right here, we've warmed up by about 1.2 degrees Celsius. So you may have heard that the Paris commitment committed us to staying well below 2 degrees Celsius of warming, with an aim of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. Well, we're already at 1.1 or 1.2, and if we just straight line kept going at the way temperatures have been warming, we would be hitting that 1.5 degree limit in just 15 years from now, 2036. And if we're straight line, this isn't a forecast, this is just a simple way of extrapolating a what if scenario, is we wouldn't stay well below 2 degrees like the Paris Agreement said, we would actually hit 2 degrees in 2063 and keep going beyond it. So really need to act on this quickly, or else we're not going to be able to avoid those levels of warming. And that's going to mean a big cut in emissions. So basically the policies that have been enacted so far, where there are firm policies that the US has done, such as the clean vehicle, the improvements in vehicle mileage that's been mandated, such as the transition that we've already been having of closing a number of coal plants, the policies the European Union has done to cut their CO2 emissions with a cap and trade market. Those things are already baked into the blue, and they put us on a pace of 2.5 to 2.9 Celsius of warming. That's a lot better than when I started teaching this, started looking at what Climate Action Tracker was projecting. A lot of people thought business as usual was more like 4 degrees Celsius. So because we've been having the transition begin, because wind and solar are growing so fast, because we're being more efficient, because we're replacing coal with gas, we're no longer on a 4 or 5 degrees Celsius trajectory, but we're not on a 1.5 or 2 degree either. Our current is that this is showing emissions. Emissions are probably peaking soon, but then might plateau at this extremely high level. This means 50 billion tons a year, or about 7 tons, about 14,000 pounds per person for every person on the planet per year, and just barely slowing. If we were serious about 1.5 degrees, we would need to get to net zero by the 2060s. So this green curve shows just this jumping off a cliff sort of drop in emissions that we would need if we want to be 1.5 degrees. And if we want to be closer to a 2 degree scenario, then we need to have emissions peak very soon and then come back. They don't need to go all the way to zero immediately, but they do need to come down very, very quickly if we're serious about those Paris Agreement targets and avoiding the worst impacts of climate change.
Hey, Dan.
Yep.
I'll go ahead and just jump in with a couple of questions that have popped up, and they are, about previous slides. So this is a question from Steve Hanrahan. Do the solar figures represent residential and utility scale, and what's the percentage of each?
Yeah. So the solar figures that I showed for Texas, the particular way that ERCOT plots it here is ERCOT is just looking at utility scale solar that's providing solar back into the grid. So for their planning purposes, when they're thinking of how much resources they have that are adding to the grid and that they tally, that this is just solar farms. This doesn't count rooftop solar. I think rooftop solar in Texas is down on the order of, I don't know, 1 or 2 gigawatts, or maybe even less than that. So where the explosive growth is in Texas has been in these solar farms. Texas lags very far behind many other states in how much rooftop solar we have. I have rooftop solar. I'm absolutely a fan of it, but it's admittedly it's very small compared to how fast the utility is growing in Texas.
Right. Yeah, definitely utility scale is what these numbers are, and 1 to 2 gigawatts sounds about right, which is lower than a lot of the states, I think, as you indicated, Dan. But we don't have that exact number yet showing up in this graph. It's only utility scale. The other question from Jeffrey Tian, excellent presentation. While we grow solar and wind energy, what is the plan about nuclear? I guess like future plant, etc.
Right. So Texas has 2 nuclear plants. It has the Comanche Peak plant and it has South Texas plant. Each of them have 2 units. Each of them, like every other nuclear plant in this country, were built before 3 Mile Island. So I don't remember the exact dates, but they were built 1970s or earlier. Texas had a large, 5 or so proposed new units, including the operators of those 2 plants had proposed to build new reactors when Department of Energy was offering subsidies and when coal and gas were much more expensive than they are today, when wind and solar were more expensive. They abandoned those plans, and the only 2 units being built in the entire country right now are the units at Plant Vogtle in Georgia, which are now, I think, about 5 years overdue and have run on the order of $8 to $10 billion over budget. So they're going to be unbelievably expensive. They actually bankrupted Westinghouse in the process. South Carolina was also trying to build 2. After they spent about $6 billion, they decided to cut their losses and have the most expensive holes in the ground there. So I think other utility companies have pretty much been frightened away of doing it. In Texas, of course, we're a regulated market. So unlike Georgia, where Georgia Power can pass those costs along, to their regulated monopoly customers, at least part of it, they're also losing huge amounts as a company. I think in Texas, companies would be even more cautious about, undergoing $20 billion of expenses that they couldn't recoup, because the costs of that are about 5 to 6 times what wind and solar costs, and maybe 3 times as much as what gas costs. So I don't see any real prospects of getting new nuclear in the state. So far, there aren't any plans to close the 2 that we have, and definitely keeping those is important to keeping that 10% clean electricity that we get from the existing nuclear.
Okay, so at this point, you don't know of any plans right now in the future queue.
I know for certain there are no plans for. There are 0 proposals for new nuclear in Texas on the books.
Okay, got it. And let me ask one more, and then we can then get back to your presentation and pick them up later. So this question from Srihari Garantia, is it not better for the ERCOT grid to be connected to the other grid so we have some insurance in extreme weather events?
It would absolutely be better for ERCOT to be connected to other events, and this is other grids. Everything else I've shown is just showing what the facts are. Here I will editorialize for a moment, is just we're shooting ourselves in the foot with this decision, and it is just foolish in so many ways to not be connected. When we had a crisis, a disaster like we had in February, we couldn't import from other states. Yes, other states struggled for a few hours, but then they got themselves back up to speed. We were down for a few days. So that flexibility, that resilience in a crisis, we lost because of not having those lines. And we're just throwing away opportunities to make money the rest of the year. Is that, look, we're this unique green area that's both really windy and really sunny. We've got cheap land, we've got cheap labor, we've got farmers with really wind blowing away their topsoil who would love to have more wind farms. We're not building more because there's not enough transmission lines to get it to the eastern part of the state. And we could be selling it to the other parts of the country as well. I mean, this could be the Saudi Arabia of clean energy. We could be growing even twice as fast as we are if we could export that to other states. So it's not a silver bullet solution. We also need to harden our natural gas supply. We need better winterized all of our plants, including the nuclear unit that's water supply pros. There's a lot of things we need to do. It wouldn't have been a perfect solution, but it would do so much good, both protecting us from shortages and making it more profitable the rest of the time, helping the rest of the country clean up, as well as just the fact that in every other form of the energy business, saying that we've got this many people on the call from Bel Air, I'm sure a large number of you must be in the energy industry knowing this city. When it comes to anything other than electricity, we're not afraid of competing in national or international markets. We're not afraid of having federal regulation of our natural gas pipelines, our oil pipelines, the LNG we sell overseas, everything else, every other form of energy we buy and sell and trade and regulate. And somehow we have this unique fixation that we need to be on our own on this island for electricity, the one fuel that can go at the speed of light moving to any other state. So you can tell I have strong opinions on that. Everything else is just the facts, but yeah, I do advocate whenever I can is let's convince our leaders to stop making this mistake.
And again, Dan, the main reason, as you understand it, is because if Texas did interconnect with other grids, then we would be subject to more stringent federal regulation.
We would be subject to more stringent federal regulation, right?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah, you can move on.
Okay. So putting the US in context, since I will focus on what the US can do, is that the US is the second largest emitter in the world. For most of our history, we were the leading emitter. China surpassed us. China now leads the world by a large margin. The US has the most emissions per capita of any major country. This makes us about 14% or so of the world's emissions come from the United States. So we're important, but we can't do it alone. If we're going to, what do we need to clean up in the US? Well, where we get our energy today is roughly a third from petroleum, nearly a third from natural gas. Coal is shrinking in its use in the US. We see nuclear is this important clean 9%, and then renewables are about 12%. So this is what we get things from today. And the emissions that come from that, about 40% of emissions come from burning oil, 24% of US CO2 emissions are from coal, 32% from natural gas. And see the sectors that we'll need to clean up, especially transportation and power plants being those two biggest sectors of where emissions come from. So to clean this up, I showed it as that building the building on those three pillars of efficiency, clean electricity, and fuel switching. This is the same conclusions that the White House came to when President Obama issued this plan that I think was expected. It came out the week after President Trump was elected. And so I think it was expected to be a plan. They developed this when they thought that Hillary Clinton was going to be the next president to carry this forward. And the plan that they came up with had this idea. They said, we're starting from this much emissions in 2005. If we just have normal growth of the economy and growth of population, we're going to end up being here. That the US alone would be emitting 10 billion tons a year, or on the order of 30 tons per person per year. Many, many, many times our body weight in CO2. If we want to get that down to this target of President Obama set a target of an 80% emission reduction, or scientists argue that we should maybe be aiming for net zero instead. If we want to get down here, it was this waterfall plot. We're starting here. Efficiency can get us this far by making more efficient transportation, buildings, and industry. Clean electricity is actually the biggest piece, is that by going to renewables or carbon capture or nuclear, any combination of those can get us cleaner electricity. And then we can use that clean electricity for electrification to transform some of the uses of the fuel switching, and then have other paths that take us to removing some of the CO2 from the air. Another way of framing this, these are different ways of framing the same problem. I really like the way that NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, framed it here. And I spent a couple of days out at NREL while researching my book, is that they defined things in terms of this black thick line. This black thick line is what to focus on here. This is what I would call the electric frontier, is how I frame it in my book. So we have this frontier where everything below the black line, everything below this barricade, is electricity, and everything above the black line is powered by things other than electricity, like natural gas or like oil or like coal. So when it comes to transportation, we hardly electrify anything. And so almost everything is running on oil. This is a few years out of date, but even with all the Teslas today, it's still almost all non-electricity. Industry is a mix. So a lot of industry uses electricity, but other industry, especially mining and the paper industry and refining, they burn a lot of oil and coal and natural gas. Residential, we get all of our cooling and lighting and refrigeration from electricity, and our heating is a mix. Right now, we get some of our water and space heating from electricity. Some of it is from fuel oil and natural gas. And then commercial, it's like our offices and stores, they have this mix as well. So if we want to get rid of emissions, efficiency is a way to shrink all these boxes. Efficiency means we would just need less energy overall. Clean electricity means everything that's below here, all this below the black line, is powered by power plants. So all this is already on electricity. If we can just clean up electricity, then we'll reduce those emissions. So we can clean up our lighting, our refrigeration, our cooling, our chemical plants just by cleaning up electricity. For everything above this line, we need to electrify it. We need to switch it to electricity. We need to move this black curve up so that that clean electricity we're generating down here can start to take over some of these dirtier parts of the economy. And for what we can't decarbonize, what we can't electrify, we need to switch to other things. So the efficiency, what can we do there? This is a study that was done by the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. They found that under baseline projections from the Department of Energy, there would be some efficiency. And so just naturally, with what industry is already doing business as usual, emissions will trend down a little bit as we switch to cleaner cars and so on. But if we do everything we can to become more efficient, they argue that could get us halfway there, halfway to zero. Because just with efficiency, not with changing any power plant, not with doing anything else, just through efficiency measures alone, they argue we could cut emissions in half. And most of these would be things that would save us money, would save more money on fuel than they cost to implement. So that's the efficiency pillar. I'm going to talk more about the electricity pillar. How do we go to clean electricity? Any of these options in this box are very clean. And so you'll hear the silliest arguments about, is nuclear cleaner than solar or solar cleaner than wind? All of them are very, very low in emissions. When it comes to what warms the climate, when it comes to what pollutes the air, all of them are extremely, extremely low, factor of 10, 20, 30, lower than any of these fossil fuels. So let's stop the fighting between which is cleaner between these. These are all very, very clean options, whereas fossil fuels emit huge amounts of electricity. Even if we applied carbon capture to coal plants, they would still emit far more emissions than any of these clean options. And those clean options are now the cheapest. So this shows the cost. This axis shows what does it cost to make new electricity. If we were building new electricity sources from scratch, and I've highlighted the cheapest ones is that solar, two technologies for solar photovoltaics, and wind are the cheapest ways of making electricity. And this is on an unsubsidized basis. This is before counting in the tax credits, the other subsidies that happen. So even before the subsidies, they're the cheapest options. Add in those tax credits and subsidies, and they're overwhelmingly more profitable, more affordable than anything else. These diamonds show that if you had already spent all the money on a nuclear plant or a coal plant or a gas plant, those are still competitive. If you assume that you're paying nothing for the thing itself, if you're just paying for the uranium and keeping the lights on, or just paying for the coal to go through, then yes, those can still compete. But if you had to build them new, then nuclear would cost about 5 to 7 times as much as wind and solar. Coal would cost about 4 times as much. Gas combined cycle costs a little bit more, and really depends on what the cost of natural gas is going forward. These diamonds show what it would cost if you wanted to capture the carbon from natural gas. Doing CO2 capture would make them prohibitively expensive. This diamond here is offshore wind. So for now, offshore wind is costlier than land-based wind, but this might be a better option if you are, say, near New York City and you don't have much land wind there.
Dan, I'll go ahead and just kind of maybe get a couple questions. Going back, can you go to slide 23, and let's talk about a little bit about the data there with, the one that jumps out there is China. If you look at the jump in emissions and where the US has been trending slowly down, and you could just sort of talk about that. Obviously, the thought that many folks have here is, obviously, why should we have to sort of work so hard to mitigate our emissions, et cetera, if China is just spiking up so high, and et cetera. And then, of course, India, you can see there's quite a big jump there. But if you could maybe touch on that a bit.
Right. So a lot of ways to frame this. Historically, global climate treaties, like the Kyoto Protocol, set limits for the US and Europe, and did not set limits for developing countries. So it was during that time that the Kyoto Protocol was in force for other parts of the world, that China was uncontrolled. There are lots of ways to frame this. We could be talking about this for hours. China is far and away the largest and had the fastest, most explosive growth. It does have about 4 times the population of the United States. So per capita, China is about half of the US. India per capita is minuscule compared to the US, because India also is about 4 times the population of the US. So the other thing underneath this just shows total emissions. What's very different about China than the US is, in the US, our leading source of emissions is oil. But in China, their overwhelming source of emissions is coal. And when I teach my energy and environment class, I say the phrase that we just keep coming back to with China is more than the rest of the world combined. So China burns more coal than the rest of the world combined. It has more electric cars than the rest of the world combined, more electric buses than the rest of the world combined, makes more solar panels, installs more solar panels, installs more wind. You name it, things are growing explosively quickly there. Everything bad, everything good. Most of what's decarbonizing other parts of the world is coming from Chinese factories. So lots, you can spin that 500 different ways, but yeah, that has been the story of what has driven up emissions so much, as you can see since 2000, where the overwhelming amount of change has come.
Okay, great, thank you. And a couple of questions here from John Lingenfelder. And this one maybe outside the discussion here, but can you clarify the effect of the bonds sold to reimburse energy producers for losses in February? Do you know about that, or can you comment on that, Dan?
Yeah, so there were, I'm not a finance professor, but the legislature passed provisions that lets energy companies securitize their losses. So for example, when I assume Belarus the same as we are here, that you get your gas from CenterPoint, and CenterPoint distributed the electricity. So CenterPoint buying the gas that they supplied us that month incurred way more costs because gas, hit 10 or 20 times its normal level, and they didn't pass all those costs on to consumers at once. And so the legislature decided not to claw back any of those things. There was talk, and there were some saying, look, at times natural gas went 100 times its normal rate. So there were some saying, look, that was a distortion. The gas system failed. They shouldn't be rewarded for the failure of the system and charging 100 times for what made it through. So saying we should go and reset things. They decided not to do that. So then there were all these losses that couldn't be put onto that month or the next month's bills. And so what the legislature let those companies do is to securitize them. So issue bonds. And so now for the next 10 or more years, we'll be paying added surcharges on our natural gas bills, on our electricity bills, for those companies that incurred the cost to pay off the windfall profits that got made by some of the pipeline companies and other players in this. So it's a way of, it sort of helped allow those bonanza windfall profits to still be earned, and sort of muted the uproar that might have come. Otherwise, either the $1 billion payouts couldn't have gone forward, or people would have been really upset if all 10 years worth of payments for that 1 week had come at once. We would have seen huge bills in a short time. So it's spreading them out over time. I guess the question is, though, how many disasters are we going to have? If you securitize 1 week's worth of gas over 10 years worth of payments, you don't want to be doing that too often, or else
exactly,
our bills will get very long and very large.
Sure. And then on slide 29, which I think was the one before, just before the one you've got here.
Yep.
The question from John Lingenfelder again is the CF energy cost between non-fossil and fossil sources. Let's see, I'm not sure if there's actually a question, but maybe just to sort of
this is an emissions plot here.
Oh, okay, got it.
Was it the cost? You want the cost comparison?
Yeah, maybe this one. This one. Okay, well, maybe just wanted some articulation about the energy cost between non-fossil and fossil sources. And I think what you've indicated is that there's some distinction, right, with the different technologies and the different costs here on this slide.
Right. So this is the cost to generate 1 megawatt hour from each of these options. And so showing that solar and wind are cheaper. That this isn't the only thing. It's not sunny all the time. It's not windy all the time. It's very hard to flex up and down nuclear. It's very hard to flex up and down coal. So there are things besides just cost per megawatt hour that you need to think about. But just in this first cut, looking at cost, this shows that solar and wind are now cheaper than any other option.
Okay, great. Okay, you can carry on for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then this is just showing that cost reduction that's happened. The cost of wind has fallen by 72% since 2009. The cost of solar has fallen by 90% since 2009. And that's for utility scale solar. Rooftop hasn't fallen nearly as fast. And then batteries are starting to be on the same curve, is that this is showing how the cost of lithium ion batteries have declined by more than a factor of 5 since 2010. And because of those changes, because if we were doing analysis based on the way things were 10 years ago, or back when I started teaching my class after arriving at Rice in 2006, and even up until 2014, this is a study that came out in 2014, where these scientists and economists and energy experts got together and they imagined what are scenarios, what would it take for the US to get to a net zero economy or get to a deeply decarbonized, very clean energy economy. And when they thought about this in 2012, 2013, 2014, they came up with 4 scenarios. So they had a reference case that was business as usual. There was a lot of fossil, the gray is fossil. And they came up with 4 hypothetical scenarios of what are the ways that we could get to a clean energy economy. So one was mixed, but these 3 were the very distinct scenarios. They imagined one case where we could do mostly renewables. Because they assumed it would be mostly wind because solar was super expensive and we would spend this much, we would put in this much yellow solar. They had a high nuclear case. They imagined, well, what if nuclear becomes the best way to do things? And so we build out, hundreds of nuclear plants for this. We still need some wind and solar, but we'll have a mostly nuclear case. And then they imagined, what if the best way to do things is carbon capture, capture the carbon coming out of coal and gas plants. So they had this scenario. When they did this analysis in 2014, before those South Carolina and Georgia plants had gone 2 to 3 times over budget and still aren't finished, before we had finished doing this 90% reduction in solar costs, 70% reduction in wind cost, 80% reduction in battery costs, they estimated that the nuclear would be slightly cheaper than the other scenarios, and that they said all these are plausible. We can't say one is better than the other, but any work would work. And if we had to make a guess now, we think nuclear would be the cheapest way to go. So that's 2014. I interviewed the modelers who developed this as part of the book. Fast forward to 2020, and I interviewed a lot of the people who developed these new scenarios. They say the debate is over. It's no longer thinking that there are these 4 equally likely pathways or equally likely portfolios or energy mixes. When Princeton put together this study and they came up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scenarios of how to get to net zero by 2050, sort of the same type challenge that they looked at in 2014, you see a lot of blue and yellow on this map. That is their projections of how much wind and solar we would need to build to get to clean. So all of the scenarios, and this is true for several others that are other universities, other think tanks, everyone is doing, is if you look at those new economics, the cheapest ways to do it now are with wind, battery, and solar, and blending in some hydro, blending in some nuclear, some bio. There are other things around the edges, but there's pretty much universal among everyone I spoke with for the book said wind and solar are going to lead, and everything else is going to mix in to play roles alongside it. That means we're going to have challenges in this energy transition, is that this takes a lot of space. So, for example, a scenario that I think is probably the most likely of this is if we do, one of these scenarios, we would need to cover solar on the order of anywhere from the size of Connecticut to perhaps something the size of West Virginia, covered in solar panels, solar farms to power the US. And we would need wind farm. The wind turbines themselves wouldn't take up this much space, but in terms of the area over which they're spread could be this blue area. So the turbines would be this dark blue square, but the light blue would be that much land. You could see a wind turbine in the distance from where you are. So it's going to be a lot more land, a lot more things affected by that. Maybe we can go to more rooftop solar. Maybe there are ways to adjust it. But if we're talking about these futures that are being envisioned, it isn't going to cover the country. It's not going to mean we can't have food or can't have cities, but it is substantial. And can we get to how fast can we get to that? So in the past, these sorts of transitions have been very slow. Is that we were really in a wood era. The vast majority of the power for the country from the time of the revolution up until after the Civil War, the vast majority of energy came from burning wood. And then we went into a coal era where coal was the dominant source. And we were almost 100 years in that era. And then, it took over 50 years after Spindletop to get to the oil and gas era. So these have always taken 50, 100, 150 years. And now if we need to get to net zero by 2050, are we going to go from a future that's been mostly oil, gas, and coal? Are these things that have been small sources so far, the nuclear and renewables, can those grow by 2050 to do the fastest energy transition that the world has ever seen? What gives me hope that this is possible is that we have seen other things outside of the energy arena that have grown that fast. So if we look at how fast we've adopted iPhones, how fast we've adopted microwaves, how fast we adopted black and white TVs and then color TVs, these things go really quickly and they follow these S-shaped curves, these logistic curves, where transition can happen very slowly at first and then explosively. And I think some people are seeing that with electric cars today, is that it took until a few years ago for them to get to 1%. Now it's getting near 10% worldwide, over 10% in China and parts of Europe. Today, US is lagging some, but once you get up these curves, it can go very quickly, adoption from there. Looks like that's the end of my slides. Rajiv had some others, but we'll see what question's been raised.
Sure. Okay, and then we can go over the next slide with David here, if you can go to that one. And then we'll come back for questions.
I think Joanna has been raising a hand. I don't know if she's able to put her questions in the box.
Yeah, I was going to kind of wait till we get to the question part,
sure.
and then we'll get back to Joanna's question and a couple of others. So I asked Mr. David Roylands to join the call here as well. He's the co-founder and principal of Prism Energy Solutions. He's been working with the city of Bel Air for many years on their energy and their electric supply and whatnot. And so I asked him to just kind of talk about this topic, this slide here regarding City of Bel Air municipal electricity supply. So go ahead, David.
Hey, Rajiv, thank you. Just to bring home some of the conversation, over a year ago, the City of Bel Air was facing a decision around a new electricity supply contract. And it became increasingly important to try to find an intersection between savings that could be available to us because of some of the topics that have already been discussed, and put the City of Bel Air on a trajectory to move toward more renewable. The great news is that earlier this year, the city entered into a multi-year contract that actually begins in January of 2022, where half of the city's consumption, and this is for the public facilities, there's about 65 consumption points across the city. These are traffic lights, the city hall, the courts. Half of the energy that they consume for the next many years will be sourced from a utility scale solar development that's being built in Fort Bend County. In the upper right-hand corner on this slide, you can actually see the scale of this quite large facility. In the upper left part of that picture, you can actually see a football field represented, and that will show you just how large the scale is for this utility development on solar. But the great news is the city was able to create savings in what they are charged for electricity, knowing that half of that is now going to come from a utility scale solar development. And at the same time, that agreement also offers incentives to the city to continue on its journey by providing incentives for installation of electric charging stations, as well as other type of energy efficiency projects. So across the board, the city is moving in the right direction regarding the use of renewable energy, focusing on energy efficiency, and then fortunately, through the structure of the supply agreement, they're accessing these renewable resources without changing any type of reliability or other deliverability concerns for energy.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Yeah, so as it shows in the slide, there's definitely a win-win for the city, and definitely the way that was put together. So thank you, David.
Sure. Absolutely.
So yeah, so I think the next slide should be the question slide, unless there's another one. Yeah. So okay, well, let's go ahead. I've got, I think, oh, did Joanna drop out? Okay, I think I had Joanna. Yeah, looks like she may have dropped out. Okay, well, anyways, we have a couple more questions here. So let's
Joanna's
see.
still on the call.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Joanna's still on, Joanna Moran.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I will just allow Joanna to talk then. Right. Okay, Joanna, are you there? Asked to unmute. So Joanna, if you can unmute yourself. Oh well. Yeah, I guess it's not quite happening. Oh well. Anyways, we had you raising your hand earlier, Joanna, and you should be able to talk now. But I think we're showing that you've got yourself muted. But we'll go on to one of the type questions here. So the question is that is the city of Bel Air going to do anything about encouraging rooftop solar, seeing that it's the most expensive, compared to utility solar, I think was a reference there. Does it make sense for the city to incentivize rooftop solar? So I can probably take that one, and then if the two of you all want to, chime in. But right now, the city of Bel Air, the city of Houston, for that matter, doesn't have any specific incentive for rooftop solar. The main incentive is at the federal level. There's an investment tax credit for 26%. So, I would say right now, just based on the economics of solar, with the way costs are dropping so much, that we're probably looking at a payback where 5 years ago it was probably like a 12-year payback. Now it's closer to about 6 or 7 years, and that's even without any local incentives. But as far as any incentives being offered by the city of Bel Air extra on top of that, there really hasn't been any talk that I've been aware of, to make that happen. That doesn't mean that it can't happen, but I think as of right now, there really hasn't been any initiative. But David, do you know anything about that, or do you have any comment on that from what you've heard? Or
Rajiv, what I would add, there is quite a price difference between the rooftop solar and what you would see at the utility scale level. For folks that are interested in renewable, Texas is a state that affords you consumer choice. When you're shopping for your electricity for your residence, or if you're shopping for electricity for your business, consider the renewable energy options that are there. Utility scale, as some of the charts showed, are coming in very cost competitive. The price difference between renewable programs and regular, just kind of quote unquote grid power, has narrowed. So I would say the first action to take is to look for renewable supply options for your residents or for your business. And then hopefully we'll start to see more community programs. And it doesn't have to be in the form of incentives for rooftop. Other states have adopted community solar programs where the concept of these utility scale actually moved to where individual residences or smaller businesses can subscribe and get the direct benefit. But I'd say the starting point would be take advantage of renewable programs that are being offered by a multiple of suppliers, and then stay on the look for community programs as they develop.
Yeah, I have a few comments on that as a as a rooftop solar customer myself. So it is much more expensive than solar farms, but that's if you just count the power generated. It doesn't require the transmission and distribution, so it saves those costs. And as a homeowner, you're comparing that against, the bill that you face that's, maybe 12 or 15 cents a kilowatt hour, not competing against the solar farm that maybe only costs 3 cents to generate it, but it's with all those things, and it avoids the land use. There are a lot of advantages to it. What I found is that when you figure in the federal tax credit, there's no local incentives for it, but you figure things in, and it's roughly on the order of a 10-year payback time. That's good for some people. Since I have a 25-year warranty on it, that's fine for me. Others want a faster payback time. Efficient lights, other things are going to have programmable thermostat. They'll have faster payback time. But for me, it was a choice I decided to make. I don't know if it's an issue in Bel Air. What I could say is I'm trying to add panels now. I'm going through Solar United Neighbors, which let a co-op figure out for me who had the most reliable, who had the cheapest policy, pooled together me with a couple hundred other people and got the best deal. I've been waiting several months just to add panels to the system I already have because the city of Houston red tape hasn't approved it yet. So if there is any way that city of Bel Air, I hope, isn't making the mistakes that Houston's doing of being a roadblock or a bottleneck to this getting done. I think we're at the point already where it's got advantages. People like it for certain reasons. It's got a 9 or 10 year payback time that for some people is worth doing for a 20 to 30 year investment. So if there is anything that Bel Air is doing that's getting in the way of that removing those obstacles would probably be one of the best things it could do.
Yeah, great, thank you. And then John Lingenfelder's other comment and question here is rooftop solar works great, my experience. And again, he's 180 degree towards south facing, but his comment is not many homes are ideal for rooftop solar because of roof configuration, site orientations, etc. But what about community solar, i.e. a single site of solar for a number of homes? So, I think both of you can answer this. I think from my perspective, I would say community solar takes on sort of a different definition in Texas. You could say that what the city of Bel Air is doing right now with the Fighting Jay solar farm is community solar because it's essentially, extracting electricity from a solar farm. But there are some different community solar models where like a resident can own, like 10 solar panels, and that would just be the exact simulation. But can either of you or both of you maybe touch on that, like about sort of community solar models?
Right. Yeah, it means different things in different places. It's sort of prominent places like New York where people can't have their own land to do it. I guess the best example that I've seen in the Houston area is actually another of my mentors in the same class that Rajiv has mentored for. Dory Wolf won the contract to redevelop the Sunnyside waste site, like a former landfill and hazardous waste site. She's turning that into a solar farm and setting aside 10 or some percentage of the output for that local community to be able to get discounted power in what had been this eyesore and hazardous area near them, is turning it into something to get them cheaper and cleaner power in their community and building in some education with it. So to me, I don't know if that officially gets the name community solar, but to me, that's in the spirit of
right,
helping a community getting it at scale, getting it at lower cost per unit, and getting it maybe where the individual roofs weren't great for it, but collectively they can have that supply there.
Right. Okay. And then a couple of other questions, just in general, if you can touch on, Dan, and I'll just ask them both now, but like, if you could just talk a little bit about, I think you've made a brief mention, but some of these other technologies, carbon capture and sequestration, we're hearing a lot about green hydrogen. If you can maybe tack on that. And then the second question is, there's also a lot of talk out there about, renewable energies touting, obviously, it's green, zero emissions, green energy source, but the manufacturing of solar and, batteries and whatnot is also can be very energy intensive and very damaging to the planet and whatnot. And so I've heard a lot of folks talk about that, that point isn't sort of sort of calculated as much as it should be, say, in the conversation. So maybe you can touch on those two things.
Wow, you know how to give some softball questions, don't you?
Yeah.
Maybe heard 5 questions in there that maybe could devote a full day of sessions to each of them. A lot there. With carbon capture means so many different things. What it has meant in Houston most prominently was the carbon capture that was put in at the coal plant. That parish, that's the deadliest coal plant in Texas, started capturing a small portion of the carbon from only one of its 4 coal units, and got journalists from around the world viewing it. They turned off that equipment after 3 years. They just quietly stopped capturing carbon anymore. That isn't successful. They had to build a brand new natural gas plant to run the carbon capture. It's helping to prop up a plant that could just be replaced by wind, solar, natural gas. It's causing us to burn more coal and gas. So bolting on a carbon capture to a coal plant is maybe what we thought made sense 10 or 20 years ago, but it doesn't make any sense in this country for sure. There's another way of carbon capture that also got pioneered in the Houston area, net power, where they've totally redesigned a natural gas plant to capture its carbon along the way with a whole new thermodynamic process to do it. That's really cool. That's getting its first large-scale plants built. The first one went down at LaPorte by the Air Liquide plant. Happy to talk offline about that. So some cool things there. There could be carbon capture outside of power plants. So since power can be so cheap from wind and solar and geothermal now, we can clean that up without any carbon capture. Let's devote carbon capture to ethanol plants. Let's devote carbon capture to ammonia processing and other things, to hydrogen production, capture the carbon there where it can't just be replaced by wind and solar. A lot of potential there. And then there's the other thing of capture carbon straight out of thin air. For now, the costs and resource investments in that are far too costly to be feasible. The other thing on that is that it uses enormous amounts of energy to take a needle out of a haystack, to take CO2 at 400 parts per million to separate that from air. The only way we'll ever do that is if we can get electricity to be very, very cheap and very, very clean. So if you're rooting for carbon capture out of the air, you actually really need to root for wind and solar to get even bigger and cheaper than they are today to power all that sucking of carbon out of the air. You mentioned hydrogen. Hydrogen has at least as many different avenues we could go down. I guess the big 2 paths is that the main way we get hydrogen now is from natural gas. And so the CO2 comes with it, the methane leaks if we're not getting natural gas in a clean way if we have leaks. So that has a lot of problems with it. There's hope to be moving to what some people call green hydrogen, where you separate it off from water, electricity to split water. That I think is where there's more potential, but it's more expensive right now. There's some in-between things where you could capture the carbon from the natural gas. So a lot of different ways to make it, a lot of different ways it could be used, a lot of uncertainty there. So that's the 2 that stood out. You had some other aspects.
Yeah, that's
at least
right.
that got some of the big points that I wanted to get across.
Yeah. Okay, and then I think we have a couple more here, and then we'll close it out. We're probably at close to the end of our time here. So really good questions. The one question from John Lingenfelder is, what programs in Texas are directed towards supplying renewable energies to address environmental justice for disadvantaged communities? Maybe we can talk about that a little bit as to what we know is happening in that space.
I'm not aware of any, which is a problem that I don't know. David or Rajiv, do you know?
Yeah, well, I can jump in on that one. So a lot of folks don't know the gentleman who's considered the father of environmental justice in the U.S., Dr. Robert Bullard at Texas Southern University. He's a big champion in that. He's written dozens of books on this topic, and it is something in the city of Houston Climate Action Plan. They are focusing quite a bit on environmental justice, and basically the definition of it is that in disadvantaged communities tend to be the ones where there's a lot of say, facilities or operations, whatever, that are more environmentally, challenging areas, either in the form of high emissions or landfills, et cetera. And so there's a lot of effort kind of being put into right now to try to address that and try to, kind of get out in front of that, where there's just been sort of a historically, there's been a lot of injustice in that space. So I think in the state of Texas, per se, there really isn't anything, that I understand, say from the TCEQ specifically. I know the city of Houston, though, does have focus on that. And then I know that some of the legislation being talked at the federal level in Congress is addressing that as well. The whole topic of environmental justice. So
yeah, I think it's a big gap. I think there's a lot of inequity in the way we do things. My ability to be able to put in rooftop solar, the tax credits I got for buying an electric car, those aren't accessible to people who don't have the means for the upfront cost of a brand new electric car, or the upfront owning their own home and being able to do the upfront cost of solar. Each of those things is saving me a lot of money over time, but there isn't enough out there to overcome some of those inequities.
Okay. And then the last question here from Joyce is, how about carbon capture by tree? So meaning, I guess land sink type thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so right, trees capture enormous amounts of carbon. Our trees are growing in part because there's more CO2 in the air than ever before in human history is helping them grow faster. So net trees are taking up more carbon, but they give it back up if there's a wildfire, if they die, disease, other things. So it's not a permanent sink. There's been a lot of talk about a trillion tree initiative, and people are looking at doing forestation. Most of the estimates are that if we really went all in on really a global effort towards planting more trees and reforestation and kept them from being all lost in wildfires, that we might be able to get on the order of 1 or 2 billion tons a year of sequestration from a forestry program. So when right now we're burning fossil fuels worth about 35, 38 billion tons a year, forestry to save maybe 1 or 2 billion tons is a drop in the bucket. Once we get our fossil fuel emissions down and we need to keep going towards net zero, if we get it down to 10 billion a year fossil, then that 2 that we might be able to get from forestry could be important. So it's something that we ought to be doing, that could be doing. I don't think we want the whole world to be forests. There's value to having other types of ecosystems and agriculture as well. So it definitely can play a role, but it's not going to be a silver bullet.
Yeah, and I guess the key there would be just to sort of keep the especially the dense rainforests in parts of the world that are being cut down right now in places like Brazil and Indonesia and whatnot. The deforestation that's happening, that's a huge impact if that could be reduced. And I think even at the latest COP summit, there were some global agreements in place to mitigate that as much as possible. Yeah, and I just wanted to talk about this last slide here before we go. Just in general, these are just some resources I just wanted to put out there for you all to study if you're interested. But the city of Houston has a very active and wonderful climate action plan. It's a science-based, community-driven program, to reduce greenhouse gases, meet Paris Agreement goals, carbon neutrality by 2050, and lead the global energy transition. So there's all kinds of opportunities for folks to volunteer on the various tracks and the various programs that are underway. So that's a good resource if you all aren't aware of, for you to check out. There's another one called Project Drawdown, and it's just a fantastic. It was basically a nonprofit that identifies about 100 different tracks and solutions, different ways, whether it's electricity, whether it's agriculture, transportation, of various sort of solutions out there that folks could participate in and work towards figuring out solutions. And then here locally, there's a newsletter, the Citizens Environmental Coalition. It's probably what I find, if you get on their newsletter, it's the best repository, I believe, out there with respect to just documenting dozens and dozens of things that are going on in our community, Greater Houston, Southeast Texas, with just all kinds of different initiatives, events, and opportunities for folks to get involved with. So I highly recommend the Citizens Environmental Coalition, not only just knowing about the organization, but subscribing to their weekly newsletter, which is really a good one. So all right. Well, anyways, I think we're going to end there. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Cohan. It's been a fantastic presentation, very informative. This presentation will be recorded, and a link to it will be on the City of Bel Air website under ESB Learning Academy. So hopefully, if there's any questions, you can, anything you want to see again, you can see there. And also thank you, David, as well, for jumping in and telling us about the great things the City of Bel Air is doing. So
Welcome. Thank you.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Rajiv.
okay, very good. Thank you, everybody. You have a great night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.